Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Dalid, Pasuk Lamed Chet, verse 38. And we did review in the earlier part of this Perek two miracles that Elisha had performed. The first is the Nes HaShemen, where the oil flowed, and the second is the revival of the child, who may be the Navi Ido according to the Medrash. We're now headed into the last two miracles of this Perek, and then hopefully in Perek Hay, we'll also see the miracle that he's going to perform as well with Gehazi and Naaman. Now, what again is important to notice in all of this is Elisha's manner is a bit different than Eliyahu's. I'm not going into the details, but I will share them later on for those who are interested in an email, just sharing the differences between Eliyahu and Elisha of the way they perform miracles. But the big picture always was Elisha is part of the people. Elisha involves the people more. Elisha is not in any way the zealot that Eliyahu had been. And it may be, as I mentioned last week, a reflection also of his times, because Yehoram, who was the king of the north, was not Achav. Achav and Izebel is still alive. Achav and Izebel were extreme personalities. They were moving the people further and further away from the service of God. They had introduced not only the Nevi'ei Abal, but the Nevi'ei Asheram. And Yehoram, when he takes over, we're told right away that he had begun to remove these false gods. He hadn't done it all, and he had left up still the two calves at the north and the south, which also were a point of contention that had been set up by Yeravam himself. He was better. His mother was still around, and so therefore we can assume that some of the acts that he didn't do may be because she still had an influence in the court, even though we don't see her playing that role. But he was better. And so now we head into that third miracle of this Perek, where it is a miracle of providing food. And the next one of providing food for the Bnei Nevi'im. Now, the Bnei Nevi'im, again, are a group of prophets. They are prophets who are disciples of whoever the lead prophet is. In this case, they are disciples of Elisha. And in Pasuk Lamed Chet, it picks up very simply, Elisha shav ha-Gilgala, he goes back to Gilgal, v'hara'av ba'aretz, and there's a famine in the land, u'vnei Nevi'im yoshvin lefanav, and his disciples are sitting before him. Vayomer lena'aro sfot hasir hagdola uvashel nazid livnei nevi'im. And he tells to his servant, who may be Gehazi once again, he tells him, go ahead and put the pot up, the sir hagdola, the really big, the cauldron, and prepare a food for the Bnei Nevi'im. Now, Nazid, we're familiar with still from Breshit, where we remember the Nazid Adashim, that when there is the question of the Bechorah, of who's going to get the firstborn, that ultimately Yaakov is able to buy it over a pot of lentil soup. Here, a Nazid really means any kind of vegetable soup. And he said, go prepare the vegetable soup. Vayetze achad al hasadeh, and a certain one of the disciples goes out to the field, l'laket orot, to be able to go ahead and to collect this kind of vegetable. Orot, Rashi says, it's called urga, and it's something that is good for sight, and it's good for the health. And he goes to collect, and instead he finds a different kind of vegetable. Geffen sadeh most likely is the kind of vegetable that is called the vine geffen. In essence, it's grape. It's the leaves are very similar to grape leaves. And he finds this, and he collects up all of these kinds of vegetables, and he finds the pikuot sadeh. Some suggest it's called bitter apple. We're really not sure 100% what it is. There's a very fancy Latin term for it, for what the proposal is. Ultimately, we don't know. And he collects these, and he puts them inside of his garment, all of them, to collect them. And he goes ahead and he cuts them up and he puts them into this cauldron. He didn't know what he was collecting. Now Rashi says when he collected the pakuot sadeh are poisonous. The Radak says that actually they may have been mushrooms. And the Gaonim say it's like these small gourds that are very, very bitter. But whatever it is, this person didn't know his botany. He collected the wrong kinds of things. He collects them. Vayitzku la'anashim la'echol, and they pour out the bowls for people to be able to eat. Vayhi ka'ochla me'anazid vehem tza'aku v'yamru mavet basir. Isha Elokim. And they cry out as soon as they eat it. They say, "This is poisonous. My God, God man, bring us." And I was calling out to Elisha, "Save us." V'lo yachlu lechol. They couldn't eat it. Now, the question the Rishonim deal with is, was it really poisonous or was it just god-awful terrible? According to the Radak, it was just extraordinarily bitter. According to Rashi, there was actually poison that they were fed. Vayomer ukhu kemach. And so what happens now is Elisha goes ahead and he says, grab some flour. Now, why flour? It's a miracle. But the Abarbanel says because flour is the base of bread, and bread is the core sustenance of a person. And as a result of that, it's going to counteract, according to Rashi, this poison. Vayashlech el asir, and he pours. They throw the flour into the cauldron. Vayomer tzak la'am vayochelu. They said, pour it again. V'lo haya davar ra basir, and it was all good. So miracle number 3 is that somehow Elisha manages to counteract the contents of this meal. According to Rashi, it's an absolute miracle that he saved their lives. According to the Radak, it's a miracle that he was able to transform something that was extraordinarily bitter and make it into something that's edible.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
If it was just bitter, adding the flour gives it flavor. It's really not such a miracle.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, Alina, 100%. In other words, what you're dealing with then is a miracle that's b'derech hateva. In other words, if I take something god-awful, terrible, and I put some flour into it, so now I have something that's god-awful, terrible with a thicker consistency to it.
Right.
But you're right. It does counteract. It doesn't have that same amazing miracle of poison to sustenance. 100%. Both of them are listed, though, in terms of Elisha's actions. And what's interesting in both of them, if you think about it for a moment, what's Elisha doing right now? Elisha's providing for his students. It's one more way that he's helping somebody. The next miracle, the 4th one. V'ish ba mi Baal Shalisha, and a person shows up from Baal Shalisha. Baal Shalisha is also the area of Gilgal. It's another name for it. Vayaveh le'ish Elokim lechem bikurim esrim lechem sorim. And he brings 20 loaves of bread made out of barley. And this barley was from the early harvest. So that means this must have been around Pesach time that he brought these. The Charmel b'tziklono, and he also brings stalks of the barley as well. That it's fresh barley. Vayomer ten la'am vayochelu, and Elisha says, "Hey, take these 20 loaves of bread and let the people eat from this. Let these b'nei nevi'im have something to eat." Now, 20 loaves of bread for the b'nei nevi'im is not a lot of food, and so as a result of this, what happens? Vayomer misharto, his servant tells him, wait a second, Maten zelifne mea ish. There are 100 people here, and these are just 20 loaves of bread of barley. This is not enough to feed the people. Vayomer, and he says, Ten la'am vayochelu. And Elisha says, don't worry about it, just give it to him. Kicho amar Hashem achol v'hoter. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, this will be more than enough food for them. Just give it to them, and there'll be leftover as well from all of this food. So as a result of that, Vayiten lifnehem, and he gave it to them. Vayochlu v'yotiru kidvar Hashem, and literally there was leftover food, meaning that one more time Elisha was able to feed his people, take care of his people, the Bnei Nevi'im, with something that shouldn't have worked at all. That's the end of Perek Dalet. Now, Perek Hey is yet another miracle. It's the fifth in this series. It is, however, a much longer story, 27 psukim in length, and it has a lot of additional layers to it. And those layers to it are fascinating, and especially in some of the contemporary writers, they find things that from literary styles that the Rishonim may not have focused on in the past. So, for example, Yair Zakovitz, who's a professor at Hebrew University, he looks at the opening psukim and sees that that there is a tension being played out, which is the tension of the entire parak. It's a question of power and subservience. And so I'm just going to read the first couple of psukim quickly, just so you see how that plays out. It's just a fascinating approach.
Wait, before you do that, what's the point of the miracle number 3 and 4?
3 and 4 are miracles. That's number one. Miracles, he's taking care of his disciples. In the time of famine, he's providing them to eat.
So the point is for us to show
Elisha, remember, Elisha is the person who's part of the people. Elisha is the person who cares for the people. Eliyahu, if you remember, brought famine. Elisha is the one who's trying to address it. Eliyahu is the person, Elisha is the one who is taking care of them, not running away from them. Elisha lives among them. He has, if you remember, the route that he goes through the country versus Eliyahu, who pops in and pops out. Okay.
Rabbi Matanki,
Yes.
I thought the famine was ended by Eliyahu.
It was a different famine. This is a different famine. That famine was
And
ended by Eliyahu.
is it named here? Because I must have missed that.
No, it just says it was a time of famine. Okay.
Where does it say that? I'm sorry to bother you about that, but I don't see that. I just see that they're looking for food, but it doesn't say that it's, oh, I see. Why is that Rav there?
Pasuk Lamed Chet.
Right. Why is that Rav there?
Why is that, Rav?
Yeah, we don't see any connection here. Like, where's the moral
No, there's nothing at all.
connection?
We don't see anything beyond. The Rav, in this case, is I guess the best way of saying it, a bit player.
Uh-huh.
Okay, it doesn't have that same central role. It wasn't brought on by the Navi. It's obviously when there's a Rav, there's something that we have to respond to, but it just mentioned as why was this miracle even necessary?
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So let me just go through in Perek Hay relatively quickly, but to go through it. V'Naaman sar tzava melech Aram ha'ish gadol lifnei Adonav. Naaman was the head of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great person, lifnei Adonav, before his master. Unasu fanim, he was a person who people looked up to. Kivo natan Hashem tshuva la'Aram, because through him, God had brought salvation to Aram. Va'isha gibor chayil mitzoram. And the man was valiant, but he had tzarat. That's the way we play it out. Now, interestingly, Rashi just says this pasuk just is one more set of nisim, and Rashi says, okay, that he went ahead and he was the one, that Naaman was the one who had killed Achav, who by accident hid him. Lefi tumo is the terminology, Malachim Aleph Perek Chof Bet, Pasuk Lamed Daled, striking Achav with the arrow. He had been that salvation, but it was because it was just by accident. Natan Hashem tshuva la'Aram. It's what God really was the one who caused this. However, Naaman was also a person who had tzaraat. The Medrash points out, okay, that he had tzaraat as a punishment, according to the Medrash, for having taken captive a young girl. We'll see her play a role in a moment. According to the Mitzudat David, he says that he wanted to go into war all the time, and the tzarat was the kind of thing that held him back. There was a way HaKadosh Baruch Hu kind of kept him back. There is, however, in the Gemara that tzarat is also one of those things that is caused by a sense of haughtiness. That if a person is just too full of themselves, that tzarat is one of the punishments. We normally think of tzarat as a punishment only for Lashon Hara. There are 11 different things mentioned in the Gemara that tzarat is a punishment for. One of this is behaving like Naaman behaved. That's the opening pasuk. And that's the way the Rishonim normally look at it. But the way Zakovitz looks at it, he says, wait a second, look at each one of these phrases. There are 4 pieces to this first pasuk. The first one says, Naaman Sar Tzava. Okay? He is a military general, but he isn't the leader, Melech Aram. He belonged to Melech Aram. Haya Ish Gadol, he was this great person, Lifnei Adonav, but he still had to be subservient to his master. Unesu Panim, everyone looked up to him. Kivonatan Hashem Shual Aram. It wasn't really what he did, it's God did it. Vaishaya Gibor Chayil, he was this valiant warrior, Mitzorah, but he had leprosy. So each one of these phrases, according to Zakovitz, kind of sets up the theme for what we're going to be talking about. An idea of power versus subservience. And in Naaman's own personality, there's this struggle at all this time. He really thinks he's the end all and be all. And yet he finds, and then every step of the way, there's something that's holding him back. Va'aram yatsu gidudim.
I thought,
Yeah.
excuse me. I thought the Torat did not affect people outside of the Jewish people.
Guess what? It does.
I guess.
Okay. Va'aram yatsu gidudim. Aram was going out gidudim. Now gidudim, this is almost like they had marauding armies that were going into Eretz Yisrael, vayishbu Eretz Yisrael naraktana, and they captured a young girl. Now the problem with the phrase naraktana is halachically, a na'ara is different than a ktana. A ktana is a minor, a girl under the age of 12. A na'ara halachically is between 12 and 12 and a half. And so the Meforshim are looking at this. How is it possible that you can have a na'ara and ketana? So Rashi quotes a medrash that she wasn't a na'ara, but rather she was a ketana, she was a minor from the city Na'aron. So she was a na'ara, a Na'aronian, who was a ketana, who was a minor. The Dat Mikra suggests, no, that's not it. She was captured as a minor, and now she has grown up a bit. However, the Mitzudat says, hey, we can solve this very easily. A ketana can also be called a na'ara. Okay, if you look in Yeshayahu, v'nar katan noheg bam. It's possible you can talk about those two. Interestingly, what's I think the best piece about this is something that Alex Israel mentions, and he says the main point is whatever she is, she's young, she's powerless, and yet in just a moment we're going to see that she's the source of salvation for this Gibor Chayil, for this very, very powerful person. Vatehi lifnei Eshet Naaman, and she was serving Eshet Naaman. In this parak, there are 2 words that keep on cropping up that are milot manchot. One is lifnei, before, and the other is the word adon. Lifnei and adon each appear 7 times in this parak. And again, if you remember, power and subservience, lifnei and adon, adon is the word of power, lifnei is a word of subservience. Vatomer el gvirta, achale adoni. And she turns to her mistress and she says, let me beseech my master. Achale, in other words, as Targum Yonatan says, tovei Rabbonai. Okay, tovei Rabbonai is almost like halavai. Okay, that if only my master would. Interestingly, in modern Hebrew now, it seems to be the same word. We know that if you're familiar with the slang of achla, comes like this. But forget achla for a minute. Just think about ochila la Hashem, which we had in the Yom Noraim. Okay, I beseech, I'm looking out, I'm praying to God. Vayichal Moshe, same word that we have in all of these pieces. Lifnei hanavi asher b'Shomron, let him go before the Navi who is in Shomron, az yasofo to mitzarato. And the Navi can cure him from his tzarat. Vayomer Melech Aram, I'm sorry, Vayavo, Vayaged Ladonav Lemor. And so Naaman goes and he asks his master being his king, Kazot v'chazot dibra hanara shem Eretz Yisrael. Such and such is what this girl from Eretz Yisrael said to me. Vayomer melech Aram lech bo ve'eshlecha sefer melech Yisrael. He says to her, listen, go, and I will come and go, I will send with you a message, a letter to the king of Israel, Vayelech, Vayikach biyado eser kikarei kesef v'sheshat alafim zahav ve'eser chalifot begadim. And he goes and he takes along with him silver and gold, and he also takes with 10 changes of clothing. Now, the 10 changes of clothing are even more interesting than the silver and the gold. The reason why the silver and gold, we understand these are gifts that you would give. The clothing is the kind of clothing that was given from a royal to another. These are regal garments. These are signs of power in clothing as well. Vayavem, and so they go ahead. Vayaveh hasefer el melech Yisrael lemor, and they bring the book, this letter to the king, and it says, Ve'atakevu hasefer hazeh elecha. When this letter arrives, Hine shalachti elecha et Naaman avdi. I've sent Naaman my servant, ve'asafto mitzarato, and I want you to cure him from his leprosy. Now, what's unusual about this letter is it seems to be awfully brief. It doesn't seem to be a real letter. Where is, dear Melech Yisrael, sincerely, Melech Aram? Where's all the stuff that goes with it? So the Radak says very simply that this is the normal nature of the Tanakh. We're just cutting to the chase. There must have been this flowery introduction. There must have been all of these praises. And at the end, there must have been all of these, prayers and thanks and all the rest of things that occur. And this is just the bottom line of the letter. Interestingly, again, and this is against the Radak, Zakovitz suggests that maybe this was all the letter was. And maybe what this is about goes back to that idea of Aram Yatsu Gedudim back in Pasuk Bet. Why? Aram is sending these marauding armies into the north. They are kidnapping people. They are capturing things. What does it say about Aram and the Jewish people? It would seem to be a situation where we're suggesting that Aram did not have any respect for the Jewish people, that they viewed themselves as powerful, independent people who were able to do their will against the Jewish people, but they weren't ready for all-out war. This was a war of attrition. Says Zakovitz, in a situation like that, you're not going to get a letter from the king with all of these shvachot, but rather the king of Aram is writing to the king of Israel as if the king of Israel is subservient to him. Says, here's the fact, just do this, take care of it, which also explains the very next pasuk very well, because in the next pasuk it says, Vayhi kikro melech Yisrael et hasefer, that as soon as the Jewish king, the northern king read it, Yoram, Vayikra begadav, he tore kriya, he was in mourning, Vayomer Elokim ani lahamitu lachayot, ki zeh sholeach elai lasof ish mitzarato, I am the one who has the power to bring about life or to cause death. This person sends to me that he wants me to cure tzarat. This person is just looking for an excuse to attack me. Now, again, if they were equals, and this was a normal, beautiful diplomatic exchange, why is he reacting so strongly? If, however, the king of the north, Yehoram, was feeling threatened by Melech Aram, and if Melech Aram was typically in a position of showing power, Melech Yisrael could understand right away, this is an expression of power. He literally is trying to set me up for failure. So that explanation of Zakovitz fits pretty well into these psukim Who's right? We don't know. It could be the Radak's approach. It could be this. And if it's the Radak's approach, that still they were equals. It's still a request that he was afraid what would happen when he couldn't do it because he thought he could. And then obviously, if he can't, that it could be misunderstood that maybe he didn't want to do it. All of those are possibilities. But there is one more question in the background, which the Radak asks. He says, wait a second. We have Elisha. Elisha's making oil, and Elisha is bringing people back to life, and Elisha is making sure that things that are poison are healthy and things that are not enough are enough. Just call Elisha. This sounds like it's right up his alley. Why isn't Yehoram turning to him? Why is he immediately assuming this is never going to happen? Elisha, by the way, we know was in the Shomron area always. The Radak says it's very simple. Yehoram knew that he still allowed Avodah Zarah to stay in the north. And he was convinced that if he turns to Elisha, Elisha's not going to help him because he knows, Yehoram knows he's wrong on certain things. He is embarrassed to turn to Elisha. Vayehi ki shmoa Elisha ish Elokim ki karam el Yisrael b'gadav. But when Elisha hears about this, that the king of the north has now torn Kriya, he sends a note to the king saying, Lama karata begadecha? Why'd you tear Kriya? Yavona Eli, let him come to me, v'yadaki yesh navi v'Yisrael. Let Naaman know that we have power. There's prophets in Israel. Now, again, to go back into trying to understand the scenario, the king of Israel tears Kriya was not a small act. This made the headlines. And Elisha was nearby, and so Elisha would hear about it. It wasn't necessarily that it was communicated to him directly, but this was a national threat. And people saw it, and people told Elisha about it. So Elisha says, bring him to me. Now, the other question that exists is why does he have to go to Elisha? Can't Elisha just say, I'm praying to God, he'll be cured? What was the point of bringing him? So the Malbim says the point of bringing him is to make sure that Naaman gets the message, V'yeda ki yesh navi b'Yisrael, to understand that the prophecy is within the Jewish people. If this was done remotely, if it had been done over Zoom, who knows what Naaman would have thought? Naaman might have thought that the king had the power. Naaman might have thought something else. This way, Elisha's able to control the message and make sure it's real. Remember, by the way, in the case of the child who we say may have been Edo, who Elisha revived, initially he sent Gehazi with the staff, and he told Gehazi place the staff on the child, and nothing worked. The Meforshim there say the reason, and this is based on the Medrash, because Gehazi had really mocked it. It could have worked. But maybe for the very same reason it didn't work. Maybe the idea even there was within the Jewish people that we wanted to make sure that Elisha was able to do the Kiddush Hashem, that it comes from a Navi. It's not some magical staff that brings people back, but rather it literally comes from the Navi, which is unlike what we saw when Elisha showed up, and unlike what we're going to see now as well, that it comes directly from the Navi each case, so there's no misunderstandings. Vayavo Naaman, so Naaman shows up, Bisusav, with his horses, Uverichbo, and with his chariot, Vayamod Petach Habayit LaElisha, and he stands right by the entrance to the house of Elisha. Imagine the scene for a moment. What's Naaman doing? Naaman is showing up with all of his power. He wants to be the powerful one. Naaman has this difficult time in his life. Everything he accomplished in Posuk Aleph, we say there was the opposite to it. There was the power and the subservience. He ends up following the little girl's advice. He shows up to Eretz Yisrael to seek help for what wasn't able to be done in Aram. He's now going to the Navi. He's literally on his high horse or in his chariot, and he's showing up at the Navi. And it doesn't even say Vayamod Petach Habayid la'alisha doesn't mean that he even got off of his chariot. He could have just stopped the chariot and stayed on the chariot right there. One more thing, okay, that along the way, if you notice, Besusav is written chaser. It's bet samach vav, and it's missing a yud. It should have been susim shelo, right? But it's written as if it was suso, as if it was just his horse. It's not how we pronounce it, but that's the way it's written. It could be that, and this is very different than what I just explained. The Klei Akar says maybe he didn't come with all of the power. Maybe the way he came was by himself. And maybe he didn't. Maybe the Ketiv, the way the text is actually written, is trying to say that he came somewhat in a quiet fashion. It doesn't fit with most of the other Meforshim. It doesn't seem to be the scene itself, but it would explain this. And the Kli Yakar says that this might be the hidden message within that Kri Uchtiv of the Pasuk. Vayishlach elav Elisha malach lemor. And Elisha goes ahead and he sends a messenger out. He doesn't go himself. Okay, why? Because he didn't want Naaman to think that this is some kind of trick. He wanted Naaman to understand he's coming to the Navi, but the Navi doesn't have to be directly involved with it in the same way. Haloch v'rachatzta sheva b'amim b'Yarden. Go, bathe 7 times in the Jordan. Vayashov b'sarcha l'cha utahir. He says, there, your skin will return to the way it was. Now, what's interesting is the Malbim says that in normal fashion, if a person has some kind of skin disease, bathing in cold water is not what's going to bring any kind of healing. And therefore, what he is suggesting to him is the antithesis, according to the Malbim, of what you would think a medical kind of response would be. Vayiktsov Naaman vayelach. Naaman just blows up over this and he goes, vayelach, vayomer, and he says, Hine amarti elai yetzei yatzov amad v'kara b'shem Hashem Elokav v'nif yado el hamakom v'asaf hamitzorah. Listen, he goes ahead. What is this person telling me? This Navi? I don't get it. This Navi could have said to me, he should have, that he would at least come out. He didn't come out of his house. There was no COVID. Okay, there was no issue with that. Number 2, what I would have expected, come out, he would have stood, he would have gone ahead and said something to his God. He would have waved his hands over my tzarat and would have gone away. This is bogus what this Navi is trying to suggest to me. He's furious. Halotov Amanau Farpar. Isn't the rivers of Amanah and Farpar, aren't they better than this Jordan River? Both of those were rivers that are in the Damascus area. There's some debate of which river it is in the Damascus area, but those are the rivers that he was familiar with. And he says, this whole idea of bathing is just silly. I could have gone there. Mikol Meimei Yisrael. Any river in Israel, is the ones in Damascus are better. Halor Achatz Behem V'Tarti. I could have just gone there and it would have worked. In other words, it hasn't done anything to me. Rabbi Yoni ben Janach says that all of these times I bathed there. V'Taharti, it never did anything for me. Vayifen, so he turns, Vayelech b'chema, and he's running away angry. He's leaving the Navi angry. Vayikshu avadav v'yidabru elav. And so his servants speak to him. Now, again, if you remember, the Klei Yakar said earlier that it was Suso, or instead of Susav, the way that it was written, even though we pronounce it Susav, that there was some kind of like a secret mission. Here already, it seems to be difficult with the Klei Yakar because it says his servants are there. Vayidabru elav, and they speak to Ve'amru, Avi, and they speak to him, our master. Avi doesn't just mean father, it means master. Davar gadol hanavi diber elecha. Okay, was this really such a big thing he wants from you? Hello, Tessa. it won't hurt, try it. Even though he says, how much more so? If he had told you do something really big, you would have done it. Now he's asking you something little, go do it. So he goes and he bathes 7 times in the Yarden. Kidvar Isha Elokim, just like the Isha Elokim had told him to do. Vayashov b'saro, and at that point, his skin returned kivsar nar katon v'itar, like that of a small child, and it was healed. Interestingly, nar katon and narak tanam, that there may be some literary piece to this as well, that the narak tana, this little girl, had suggested she do this, and how does his skin feel at the end? Like a nar katon. Vayashov el isha elokim. And he comes back to the Isha Elokim. Hu v'chol machanehu. Now it's not him and his horses and his chariots, or according to the Klei Yakar, he alone. Now he comes back with everybody. Vayavo vayamod lefanav. And he stands before him. If you remember, the last time around, he didn't even get off of his chariot. He was at the Petach HaBayit. He was expecting Elisha to come out to greet him. Now he's going lefanav. Now he's standing before him, and that's the sign. It's the Mitzudat David says, "Ke'eved ha'omed lifnei rabo." When he says, like a servant who stands before his master. Vayomer, and he says, "Hinei na yadati ki ein Elokim b'chol haaretz ki im b'Yisrael. Ein Elohim b'chol haaretz ki im b'Yisrael." There is no God in this land except for the God of Israel. And therefore, please take from me this gift from your servant. He's giving it because he was healed. The Malbim, however, says there's a problem. Okay, the problem would be you're not allowed to take gifts from pagans. So what's happening is that actually Naaman starts off by saying, I'm not a pagan anymore. I'm fine. Now you can take the gift because I denounce all other idols. There's only one God. I'm a monotheist now. So take my gift. That's the Malbim. The Rashi just says that what he's offering him is the same kind of thing you offer the person who you serve. I'm going to give you something. I want to give you something. Vayomer, Chai Hashem, Asher Amadati Lifanav Imekach. And Elisha says, by the name of God, I'm not going to take anything. I won't take anything. Naaman tries to convince him, but he refuses. Rashi again goes back to the same kind of point. And Rashi says that this gift had some kind of avodah zarah connection to it, and he didn't want to take it. But I'm not sure if we have to only go with Rashi's approach on this, because also at the very same time, by refusing to take it, and we'll see in a little bit later where Gehazi grabs it, that he's elevating this point. He's not saying this is about payment or anything else. If you remember, we just read, last week, in Michut vad Tzorchnal, that when the Melech's dome came out to Avraham and wanted to let him take the spoils, he said, I don't want anything as well. The Radak says, though, unlike Rashi, this is all enrolled to be Mekadesh Shem Shemaim. There is nothing in it for Elisha. That's what Elisha's trying to say. It's all about God.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Wasn't the gift from the king of Aram to the king of Israel?
There was a gift from the king of Aram to the king of Israel. This is different.
Oh, this is separate.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Vayomer Naaman v'lo yutan na la'avdecha masa tzemed paradim adama ki lo yaseh od avdecha ola v'zevach le'elokim achirim. Naaman tries something else. Velo is actually an introduction. It's like we would say, hello. If that's the case, Yutan alavadecha masad semed paradim adamam. Can I take back to Aram earth from the land of Israel, the amount that would be able to be taken by a pair of mules? Ki lo yaseh od avdecha olah v'zevach le'elohim achirim. I am no longer going to be worshiping other gods. Ki im la Hashem. I'm only going to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now, interestingly, he's asking for this because this is, to him, the Abarbanel says he's asking for the ground on which the Navi was walking. Okay, he's asking, the Ralbag says, for the ground from where the Navi lives. The Radak says he's asking because he wants to make sure that from now on, whatever he does is not through any kind of theft. He wants it to be with their permission, and it's as if he's taking a piece of Eretz Yisrael along with him. Lahavdil, the custom we have that when a person passes away, you take some of the Adamah of Eretz Yisrael and you put it in the person's casket. You bury it alongside with them. The same concept, lahavdil elaf havdalot, which he wants. Says, I'm sorry, but he says, I got one problem, Naaman says, and I hope that God will forgive me for this. Bevo Adoni Veit Rimon. When my master, the king, goes to Beit Rimon is the Mikdash of Rimon, Lishtachavot Shama, to serve there, to bow there, Vunishan al Yadi. And he literally leans on me. I go along with him. Bishtachaveti Beit Rimon, and I bow down in this house of idolatry. Bishtachavayati Beit Rimon, Yislach. Yislach Hashem lavdecha b'dvar zeh. I'm asking in advance, understanding from God, I only worship God, but every so often I'm going to have to go with the king to Beit Rimon. When I go to Beit Rimon, he's going to worship his God. And I bow down there also. Please understand, I don't worship him. It's only with God. Vayomer lo lech l'shalom. And so he says, go in peace. Vayelech me'ito kivrat aretz. And he leaves and he goes kivrat aretz. Kivrat aretz is a certain amount of space. Kivrat aretz maybe leaves the town. That's the Abarbanel. The Radak says it's 2,000 amot, which is called a meal as well. He leaves. But the question goes back to is, okay, he asked of Elisha that, please make sure God understands. Did Elisha answer him? Nowadays when people say, how are you doing? And the response is, Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem is not a response. It's not an answer. It's a response, but it's not an answer. Baruch Hashem could be, Baruch Hashem, I feel miserable, but praise be God, whatever it is. It could be Baruch Hashem, I feel wonderful. It could be Baruch Hashem, if I don't answer you, you'll leave me alone. Whatever Baruch Hashem might be at this moment, it's Baruch Hashem. Here, the Navi says, Lech l'shalom. He doesn't answer him at all. Now, the Dag Mikra says that really just means because there was no need for it. Because this wasn't a problem for Bnei Noach. That he wasn't a Jew, and there's no issue, there's no shaila, so just don't worry about it. Okay, Lech l'shalom, go in peace. The Abarbanel says that actually, okay, you can go. The answer ultimately is you can go. Interestingly, Kogan and Tadmor in the Anchor Bible series, they say what's more important is not the answer, but after all of these words, if you look at this entire exchange which was taking place between Naaman and between Elisha, Naaman is talking a lot. Okay, Naaman, and what do we see? The only words is the refusal initially in Tet Zion of Elisha taking things. And then Naaman's talking, and Elisha says, Lech l'shalom. He's silent in this. That with all of the things Naaman wants to say, Elisha really is being very passive and just letting him talk and not responding in any meaningful way because there's no need for anything more to say. Pasuk Chaf. Vayomer Gehazi nar Elisha ish Elokim. Now notice all of these titles, because these are not insignificant. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. Elisha, who is the man of God. And we're setting this up because we want to understand the depths of depravity of Gehazi. Hine chashach Adoni et Naaman ha'arami hazeh mikacha miyado et asher hivi. My master has refused. He's missed out this opportunity. He didn't want to take that which has been brought. Chai Hashem, ki imratzti acharav lakachti mitomuma. He says, I'm going to run. Ki im, okay? Will I not go after him to take something? Vayerdov Gehazi acharei Naaman, and he runs after Naaman. Vayir'eh Naaman ratz acharav, and Naaman sees that he's being followed. Vayipol me'al merkava likrato vayomer hashalom. And he goes ahead and he says, is everything okay? Now, v'yipol me'al merkavto doesn't necessarily mean to fall. Remember, the first time Rivka sees Yitzchak, we just read about it, v'yipol me'al gamal, she fell down from the camel. Doesn't mean she falls. It means you can go off quickly. You can jump off. It's the same kind of thing. Okay? V'tipol me'al gamal, Mitzudat David makes that immediately the way you get off. But if you go ahead and you do it quickly, that's the terminology. And he says right away, Hashalom, is everything all right? Vayomer shalom adoni shalachani elecha. Everything's fine. But my master sent me to you. Hine ata zabau elai shnei narim mihar Ephraim mibnei Anavim. Two people have shown up from the Bnei Nevi'im, from my master's disciples. Tanalahem kikar kesef u'shtei chalifot b'gadim. Will you give them something? Give them some silver and give them some of those clothing. Now, the Malbim says that Naaman needed some kind of excuse because, that Gehazi needed an excuse. Gehazi can't just run after him and says, my master just changed his mind. He wants something. But he says, a new situation. And what kind of situation? A situation where it's not for my master. It's for somebody else. It's in the typology of Elisha helping other people. He wants to have that. Take double. Vayifratz bo vayatzar kikarim kesef b'shnei charitim u'shnei chalifot b'gadim. He went ahead. He wrapped up these two ingots of silver in two separate little bags, and he puts two sets of clothing. Vayiten el shnei narav vayisu lefanam, and he gives it to the servants of Gehazi, and they go ahead and they leave. Vayavo el ha'ofel, and he goes ahead and he goes to the Ophel. Now, the Ophel is the Migdal. It is, for instance, a place which is shaded, okay, like Afilah, but in the same sense, it's a place which is guarded, okay? Targum Yonatan says, Atar Kisi, it's a place that is hidden. Vayikach miyadam, and he takes, and Gehazi takes these things that he had gotten, the silver and the garments, Vayivkod b'bayit, and he put it, okay, in his house, he hid them away. And he sends off the people. And he's coming. And he's standing before his master. But it really doesn't say standing before. If you notice, it doesn't say Vayamod lifnei Adonav. It says El Adonav. Following in this whole piece, which we've been talking about, how people are standing and where they're standing implies their attitudes. He's not standing subservient before Elisha. Gehazi, who we started out this last episode with, Nar Elisha Isha Elokim, he doesn't view himself as a Nar, he views himself as a person who can stand side by side with his master. Vayomer elav Elisha, and Elisha says, Ma'ayin Gehazi. Vayomer lo alach avdecha anavana. He says, where were you? He says, I didn't go anywhere. I was just I was here. I was here all the time. Vayomer elav lo libi halach, and he says, no, you didn't. When you went, you didn't go with me. That's mitzvah. You didn't. Lo halach libi imcha. I didn't go with you. Okay, or no, libi. My ruach nivuah, according to the Targum Yonatan, says it tells me differently that you went. When the person turned around from his chariot to give you this person, obviously being Naaman, ha'et לקחת את הכסף, לקחת בגדים וזיתים וכרמים וצאן ובקר ועבדים ושפחות. He went ahead and you took at this. Okay, you did this now. Why? Because you wanted to go ahead and just take all of these things. Did he take all of those things? He didn't. But rather, you wanted the silver and you wanted these garments to be able to get for you all of these riches, the riches of Zaitim and Kramim and Son and Bakar and olive groves and of vineyards and of sheep and of cattle and of servants and maidservants. This was all about money, what you did. Vitzarat Naaman tidbak b'cham. Says Elisha, the tzarat of Naaman that he's been cured of now is going to afflict you. Uvezar'acha liolam. And also, it's going to afflict your offspring. Question is, Lama, why were they afflicted as well? And according to the Radak, because his family was in on it. So this was, they were a family, Naaman became a family, Gehazi became a family of lepers. Vayetze milefanav mitzora kashalig. And he left, Gehazi left the presence of Elisha white as snow. Now, interestingly, milefanav, again, we find this issue of subservience. He wasn't with him. It could have just said, the Navi could have just said, Vayetze, Mitzorah Kashalig, that he left, he was completely white, but Milifanav. Elisha puts Gehazi back in his place. It's the power subservience kind of theme itself. And what's also fascinating is Tadmor and Kogan also suggest, if you look at the way the parak opens and the way the parak closes, it opens and closes in the same way. In both situations, you have a person who is afflicted with tzarat. We opened with Naaman. Naaman had the tzarat. And we close with Gehazi having this tzarat. That is like the perfect balance between the beginning and the end, a perfect story with an opening and a closing that match so well. That's the themes. And if you look at the theme of power and subservience and just look at Naaman, Naaman has this struggle at home between who he is. He comes, he thinks he is all powerful before the king of Israel. He is then put in his place by the Navi. He then accepts the subservience of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He then sees the power available. He then, at that point, the servant of the Navi, Gehazi, thinks that he is no longer a servant, that he can outwit his master by outwitting God himself. And again, we see the power and subservience he's put back into his position as he was. And we'll stop right here. Are there any questions before we end? We have a couple minutes still.
Rabbi Matanky, I
Yes.
just want to raise a point. You know, it sounds like power politics is going on here. And, you know, is it about power, or is it about power brings with it a certain set of other emotions? And we're talking about respect for spreading a Kadosh Baruch, recognition of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. It says, and when he says, Yisrael, it's
Right.
really all about wanting to understand who is, it's really about respect. I'm saying, if we use the word respect and honoring Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is where Naaman came to and where Gehazi was not.
So we can use that also terminology, but I guess the way I would say is, who is the all-powerful? Who's the omnipotent one? Okay, we talk about power because is it within God's power? Is it within the power of Naaman? So really, there is an element of power. If you don't want to view it as a power struggle, it's okay. You can say respect, who needs to be respected and who offers a respect. But, and nowhere, by the way, we're not bound by those two words. But you do see Adon being used, and you do see Lefanav being used, and those are the two milim manchot throughout the parak, and each of them also convey Adon is master, who's in charge. So I hear, and it may be a different. We can choose different words, but I do see that battle going back and forth throughout the parak.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I think it should be pointed out that next Sunday, Ira and Rivka will be Zooming with us from a faraway place.
Yes, they're going to be leaving this week. And Rivka, and I just want to know if Rivka and I have already arranged for their internet access for next week.
Thank you so much.
We should, Rabbi. Thank you. We look forward to 5 o'clock Israel time, being in touch with everyone at the shir.
Okay, well, have a safe trip. Have a successful aliyah.
And thank you so much for all your help, Rabbi.
And
Beautiful.
Ira and Rivka, if you want, next week we can do the shir in Ivrit, because by next week you're probably going to be doing a lot of when you speak English.
That's beautiful. Okay.
Thank you so much. We look forward to